the ring is, as it were, the image for all this. But you could say it's an image of something which seems to have been happening. That the 1917 revolution in Russia, we're quite prepared to believe, started off with the best of intentions, and it ended up with the Ukraine famine and the Great Terror under Stalin. Once you've started the process, it's very hard to withdraw from it. Well, that kind of image of the corruption of the good, so that it becomes ultimate evil, is, I think, both a 20th century experience and one which is, very much at the heart of the Lord of the Rings. People recognize this sort of thing.
Boromir. It is a strange fate that we should suffer so much fear and doubt over so small a thing. Such a little thing. Boromir! Give the ring to Frodo.
It is a strange fate that we should suffer so much fear and doubt over so small a thing. I'd like to welcome you back to the Pastor's Study. Glad that you're with me. I continue to hope and trust that these videos are serving you, Beverly Heights Church, as you are enduring the shelter at home and the self-quarantining through this coronavirus pandemic. Happy that I can continue to meet with you in your homes through this medium and through this process. You heard this today at the opening of the video, some comments that were made by Tom Shippey. Tom Shippey was the chair of English language and medieval literature at the University of Leeds in England. Actually, he was the same position and chair that J.R.R. Tolkien occupied for a number of years as well. Shippey succeeded J.R.R. Tolkien and was himself a Tolkien scholar as well as a scholar of English language and medieval literature. And in the interview that you heard, he was talking about the meaning and the significance of the ring in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. In fact, not only the Lord of the Rings trilogy, but the Hobbit as well. And the ring is a symbol of evil in Tolkien's mythology. And not only a symbol of evil, it is a force of evil in the world of Middle Earth, and is wreaking havoc in Middle Earth and wreaking havoc in the lives of those who have contact with it. Smeagol, who turns into a wraith, basically. Gollum is the character we know him as. His life is essentially ruined by the ring. Bilbo is being affected by the ring. Frodo is being affected by the ring, and the entire Fellowship of the Ring is being torn apart. And you saw in the clip Boromir, who was holding the ring and said to himself, it's a strange fate that we should suffer so much fear and doubt over so small a thing, this small trinket that seems minuscule in comparison to the great things of the world and of Middle Earth, but is wreaking havoc and tearing that world apart. I find a lot of sympathetic resonance, as I'm sure that you do, with that theme, as we're all sheltering in place and seeing the coronavirus having its effect in the lives of so many in America and across the world, taking the life of so many, crippling the lives of many others, not only physically, but economically, socially, psychologically, spiritually. It is this small, minuscule thing that we can't see, but is affecting our world so greatly. But I actually came back to some of the themes of the Lord of the Rings, not because of the quarantine, not because of remembering that quote necessarily, but I was reading another book over the last month or so by a philosopher by the name of Peter Kreeft. Peter Kreeft is the professor of philosophy at Boston College and the King's College, and he wrote a book recently called Doors in the Walls of the World, Signs of Transcendence in the Human Story. And I've enjoyed reading this book. It's a very clever and well-written book that basically is making the appeal that there's more to this world and more to the story that we find ourselves in than just what we see with our eyes, what we can perceive through science, that we can perceive through the natural order. There are doors in the world, doors in the walls of the world, windows that we have an opportunity to see through, and to see that our story is actually much bigger and much grander, much fuller than we might be able to see or perceive with the naked eye. And this is what bridges now the gap between Kreeft and J.R.R. Tolkien. Because as I was reading Peter Kreeft, he's talking about style, and he's established that the theme of the story is one of joy, but there's much suffering in the world. And the question that you and I, and not only you and I, but the whole world and all of human history has tried to reconcile, is how do we reconcile suffering and joy? There's something about joy and suffering, and if we're made for joy, why is there so much suffering in the world? Things can turn on a dime. The world can turn upside down. We can suffer so much fear and doubt over such a small thing, and it comes on us almost instantaneously, and our whole world can get turned upside down, and we might call that a catastrophe. But what Kreeft points out in his book is the way in which catastrophe and suffering is in God's story undone or overturned. You have catastrophe where things very quickly turn towards suffering, but you also have what Kreeft points out is a eucatastrophe. A eucatastrophe. EU catastrophe. Now that's not a word that Kreeft uses. He's getting that from J.R.R. Tolkien. And J.R.R. Tolkien coined the phrase eucatastrophe, which means a good, the prefix eu, EU, means good, catastrophe. A sudden change for the good. We're very clued into, we seem to always be very clued into the sudden change for the bad. But we're not always clued into the sudden change for the good. And that's part of God's story. That's actually part of our hope, that God can make changes that move us toward the joy and brings us out of suffering, brings us out of the fear and the doubt. And he can do that suddenly, and he can do that quickly. He may not do that in order to keep us out of the suffering. Many times God uses suffering in a redemptive way, in a powerful way, but he can very radically and powerfully make a change in our life, introduce a eucatastrophe in order to bring us out of that suffering in order that we might experience joy. And this is what Kreeft says about eucatastrophe, and he's pointing to Tolkien and an article that Tolkien wrote called On Fairy Stories. And he defines eucatastrophe this way. When that sudden turn comes, we get a piercing glimpse of joy or heart's desire. We find ourselves in suffering, but that eucatastrophe comes. It's a sudden turn in which we get a glimpse of joy or heart's desire, of heart's mending, of joy that can only come after the pain, that seems for a moment to pass outside the frame, to rend indeed the very web of story and let a gleam come through. God is a storyteller. He's writing our story, and we're finding ourselves in a chapter right now where we're suffering. But God can very quickly change the story. He can introduce a eucatastrophe, a sudden turn in which we are coming out of the suffering and into the good things that God would have for us. the good future and the joy that he has in store for us. I think that's a great thing to be reminded of in the world that we're living in right now, when the world is desperately in need of some good news. Eucatastrophe is a gospel story. Eucatastrophe is an Easter story. And having read Kreeft and being reminded that this idea of eucatastrophe comes from an essay that Tolkien wrote called On Fairy Stories, I went and I pulled out that essay and I reread through it. And at the end, Tolkien has some wonderful things to say about eucatastrophe and Easter. He says, the Christian story contains the greatest and most complete conceivable eucatastrophe. The birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of man's history. Sudden change for the good. That Jesus would come. That he would be born of men, born under the law, to redeem those who are under the law from the curse of sin, from this thing that is besetting us, this invisible thing that ruins our lives. The birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of man's history. The resurrection is the eucatastrophe of the story of the incarnation. This story begins and ends in joy. It has preeminently the inner consistency of reality. There is no tale ever told that men would rather find was true, and none which so many skeptical men have accepted as true on its own merits. I just find great hope in that, great joy in that, great reassurance in that. When we're living in a time that we would suffer the fate of such a small thing that's causing so much fear and doubt, to know that God can change the story and that he can do so quickly and he can do so powerfully and he can do so for the good. He has done so before. He has sent his son, the Lord Jesus Christ, to be born. His son died, but his son rose again. Jesus rose from the dead, the greatest miracle of all miracles, the greatest turn for the good that can ever be known. It has the ring of truth and reality. It is a door into the greater story that God has been writing for us. It is a window that shows us what God is doing, that God is in control, that God loves us, and that we have hope. We've been enjoying a series on hope in our new sermon series, and I think we have hope because of the great, as Peter says, the great eucatastrophe of the resurrection. We have a living hope because Jesus rose from the dead. And so we must go on. We must continue to persist. We must continue to walk by faith, walk by hope, walk under the knowledge that that God can and will, and has in the past and will again, change things for the good. We may not see it today, we may not see it tomorrow, but we know that because God is the one who's writing the story, that he will make that change, and we must persist. Even if we don't see it in our lifetime, God will make that change, and so we must persist. I hope that's encouraging to you. I hope that that's something that you will find hopeful. And I want to leave you as we bring this time in the pastor's study to a close with one more insight by Tom Shippey and his observations about Gandalf, because I think Gandalf serves as a model of heroism in the face of struggle, the necessity to go on in hope, knowing that God can make a sudden change for the good. And we might not see it, but that doesn't mean that God won't do it, and that doesn't mean that we can't continue on and must continue on. And so until I see you again in the pastor's study, God bless.
And that meant that the strong sense of irony and, as you say, of pointlessness, which comes up in other authors, although he knows what it is, he understands it, and there are moments when his characters give way to it a bit. Nevertheless, the drive of the story does not work like that. In fact, you might say the heroic figure in The Lord of the Rings is Gandalf, who keeps on saying, we've got to keep on going. We mustn't give up. It may look bad at the moment, but it is. We are not allowed to stop. It is our duty to continue. And he says these things in a very firm and positive way, and he gets very cross, because he is rather short-tempered, with anybody who shows any signs of defeatism. His view is, well, you may get defeated, and indeed there's a very good chance we will get defeated, but that doesn't mean you can actually stop, and it certainly doesn't mean that you start negotiating.
I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had happened.
So do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. There are other forces at work in this world, Frodo, besides the will of evil. Bilbo was meant to find the ring, in which case you also were meant to have it. And that is an encouraging thought.